In 2017, after more than a decade serving in pastoral ministry, I stepped down. There were many reasons why I stepped down, but one of those reasons was that my only daughter was 12 years old. That meant she was approaching her teen years, and I was very concerned about her being a teen as a preacher's kid, a PK as they are commonly called. Was I right in having that concern? Let's talk about it. Welcome to Fusion. I'm your host, Brendan Saunders. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, we are going to explore an aspect of the integration of faith and life. Would you do three things for me before we start? Would you, number one, hit the subscription button, subscribe to my YouTube channel? Number two, would you hit the like button and like this, the thumbs up, like this actual video? And number three, up in the top right corner of your screen is a bell. That's the notification bell. Would you ring that bell? And what that will do is it will notify you every time that I put out a new video. So, as I shared, after more than a decade of serving in pastoral ministry, in 2017, I stepped down. Now, as I said, there were multiple reasons. There were a lot of reasons why I stepped down. In that grouping of reasons why I stepped down was the fact that there were some unhealthy things in ministry. There were some inherently unhealthy things that my family had to deal with, and I won't say that this particular point was unhealthy, but it had the potential to be unhealthy. Now, I only have one child. Maybe I would have thought differently if I had multiple children, but I only had one child. And to me, I felt like the scrutiny on my daughter, who was 12 at that time, she was approaching her teenage years, and I felt that the scrutiny on her, uh, I didn't want her to have to face that scrutiny, is the bottom line. I see two general ways in which churches approach PKs, pastors' kids. I don't like either of those approaches. And again, as an only child, I did not want my daughter to deal with either side of this potential scrutiny. And so I knew that, among other things, it was a good time to step away. Keep in mind, she was 12. Her whole life, she had only known me as a pastor. Uh, so her knowledge of her dad was that he had always been a minister. Back in when she was first born, I was assisting a brand new church in downtown Baltimore. She doesn't know that on many Sunday evenings I would leave our area. We were living outside of Baltimore, the city, uh, and I would leave that and I would go into downtown Baltimore, into a very dangerous area, frankly, and assist with a church plant. She didn't know that, but in her toddler years, as she did start to know what was going on, in her toddler years, she knew me as a youth pastor. At that point, I was the youth and young adult pastor of a church, again in the Baltimore area, a church that at that time was running almost 1,000 people in attendance each week. And in fact, recently we were having some good discussion as a family about those days and how my youth just loved her. You know how it is. You have these youth, they're teenagers, and they have this youth pastor, and they love the pastor's little daughter, and so they always loved her. They always asked, where is she? And they loved when she would hang around with me as I was doing ministry. Then we relocated. We came what amounted to coming back home to Connecticut for us, and I pastored a church here in Connecticut. And that was the church that I ended up ultimately stepping down from and stepping away from full-time ministry. And to be clear, again, I've always said I may go back into full-time ministry, but I knew that at that point it was a good time for me to step away for multiple reasons, including what I have shared. So here's the two ways that I think, and I think that they're both unhealthy, but the two ways that I think that churches generally approach PKs, pastors, kids. And as I said, I don't think that they're healthy. So I would love to hear from you in the comment box. If you think that there's other ways that churches approach PKs, I would love to hear from it. If you are a PK or were a PK, I would love to hear your experience. Please comment on it. So here's way number one. Way number one is that I believe that this is the most common one. The most common approach is that they place an additional burden on the pastor's children. All of a sudden, the children of the pastor are expected to be great at everything, right? They're expected to be good kids who don't do anything wrong. They're expected to be natural leaders of youth groups and whatever endeavors they do. They're expected to have a voice and to be at the forefront of that. They're expected to be super spiritual, more spiritual than the other kids in the group. They're held up many times to the same scrutiny that a pastor is held up to. Now, listen, there are biblical standards that a pastor is held to. He should be held to those. I could be wrong on this, and that's why this is entitled Am I Wrong? But I don't necessarily see those same standards being held up to the family members, specifically the children of the pastor. Are the children of the pastor, biblically speaking, held to the same standard of holiness, righteousness, and all of that that the pastor is? Or are they simply held to the same standard that all believers are held to? I would love to, again, hear your comments. Have you experienced churches where the pastor's kids are held to a higher standard, that there is a greater expectation out of them, that they are considered expected and considered to be more spiritually mature than the other kids, than their counterparts? I see that dominant in so many churches, and so many churches don't come out and say that, but their interactions with the pastor's kid portray that, they communicate that. It's really no different, and at some point I will do an episode on what I'm about to say. It's no different than with the pastor's wife. Every church has expectations of their pastor. Every church has expectations of the pastor's wife, and every church has expectations of the pastor's kids. And that's what I'm challenging. Am I wrong about that? Am I wrong? Am I wrong that they have those expectations? And then my question is, are those expectations all biblical? What are those expectations? Are they biblical? As I've already said, I understand that there is a standard, and I would call it a higher standard, that a pastor is held to. But are his family members, and specifically in this instance, are his children, held to that same standard? Again, this is often communicated in subtle and not so subtle ways. It's the comments and the interactions that people have with the kids that kind of portray this. It's when the child steps out of line and somebody says, hey, you're the pastor's kid. You shouldn't be doing that. Should they not be doing it because it's sin and that's what the Bible says? Or should they simply not be doing it because they're the pastor's kids? I mean, am I wrong about this? I could be wrong. I don't know. I want to hear from you. So that's the most common approach that I see churches have towards pastors' kids. They put them up on the same pedestal that they put pastors on. And I'm not big on pastors being put on pedestals. I think there's a big difference between understanding and acknowledging that God does hold the minister to a higher standard, and then humans putting that person on a pedestal. I think there's a difference. So there's probably another episode that I should do about that. But nonetheless, should the pastor's kid, should the PK be put on a pedestal and have expectations that high? Well, the other approach, as you might imagine, is the exact opposite. Just as the pendulum swings one way, it swings back the other way and goes to the exact opposite. The other way that I see some churches handle the pastor's kid is that they let them do whatever. They don't actually address anything. It is well known in the church that the pastor's children are doing things that are wrong, are out of line, that are they're disruptive, that again, there are things that they are involved in that are not biblical and are not right. Maybe in the youth group, they are doing things that are sinful and detrimental to the youth group. Maybe in their own life, it is known that, as with, by the way, many Christians, that they're kind of little hypocrites, right? That they act one way in church on Sunday, but then in school and in the rest of their lives, they act completely different. And this is never addressed. This is never addressed with those children. It's never addressed with their parents, with the pastor. It's never addressed with the pastor's wife. It is just an unspoken, unknown rule. And in fact, what often happens when that happens is that there then becomes this division, especially when you get to the point where the kids are in the youth group. I love to say that, having been a youth pastor, I love to say that if you if you really want to know about a church, go minister to their youth for a year or two, because you will find out everything about everybody in the church. And I'm not saying that because of gossip. I'm saying that because teenagers are observant about what's going on. Teenagers are the first to call hypocrisy in the church. Teenagers are the first to look at adults in the church. Maybe those adults are elders. Maybe those adults are deacons. Whatever the adults are. And they're the first to then take note when those people in the church act one way in church and then act a different way outside of church. They especially take note when it's their parents, by the way, and that is not good. And by the way, that usually gets shared in youth group. In case you didn't know that as a parent, yeah, that gets shared in youth group often. It often gets shared with the youth pastor and in youth group. But what about when it's the PK, when it's the pastor's kids who are at the, I'll say, at the forefront? They're at the forefront of not good things, of sinful lifestyle, of walking in rebellion, and nobody ever approaches it. Nobody looks at the biblical mandate that when your brother sins, what you ought to do. They just keep it quiet. Keep it quiet. And as I said, this system evolves where some kids in youth group, we're always telling on them. We're always on them. Don't do this and don't do that and don't dress this way and don't do that. But those same rules then don't apply to the pastor's kid. The pastor's kids kind of do whatever they want, and somehow they escape it all. Have you ever experienced that? I would love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. So those are the two approaches. They either place a heavy burden on the pastor's kid, or they place no burden on the pastor's kid and thereby do not minister to the pastor's kid in any way. Both of those, I believe, are wrong approaches. So I would love to hear from you. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Am I wrong in thinking that? Am I wrong in that this was a reason why I stepped out of ministry, at least for a season, so that I could focus on giving my family the health that it needed, the spiritual health that it needed, the spiritual, the emotional health that it needed, that I wanted to focus on my daughter through her teenage years. I didn't want her to have a dad who preached one way on Sunday, lived another way. But more importantly, I didn't want her to have a dad who wasn't home at night because he was always at meetings. He was always leading Bible studies. He was always doing this, that, and everything else. And so what she had was a mother who was raising her and a dad who was just saying things to her that she may or may not have been receiving, because she may or may not have had a valid relationship with him. I wanted to avoid that. And so I stepped out of ministry for a season in order to be able to focus on my family. Very cliched. We often hear that. We hear that from pastors. We hear that from athletes a lot, right? Stepping down so I can focus on my family. That was one of the reasons why I stepped down, and specifically the fact that I only had one child. It wasn't, as I said, like I had multiple children who would kind of work together, balance things out with one another, and figure things out. But to have one child, I was concerned about the spotlight that would or would not be put on her. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should have kept ministering, and in the context of ministry, still focused on these things. Maybe. I don't know. Tell me in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. Can't wait to hear what you have to say. Can't wait to hear about your experiences. And I thank you very much for joining me on podcast. We'll speak again next week.